How to live faithfully when God says nothing. There comes a point in your walk with God when the noise fades. Not the noise of the world, but the noise of reassurance. You have prayed. You have waited. You have obeyed as faithfully as you know how. And yet nothing new seems to come from heaven. No fresh word. No clear direction. No sign that tells you whether you are moving forward or standing still. Just a long stretch of quiet that feels heavier the longer it lasts. This silence is different from confusion. You are not lost. You are still showing up, still believing, still choosing what you believe is right. But the familiar sense of God's nearness feels distant. Not because he has left, but because he has stopped explaining himself. And that can be more unsettling than outright hardship. Pain at least gives you something to react to. Silence leaves you alone with your faith. In moments like these, doubt often creeps in quietly. Not loud enough to shake your belief, but subtle enough to wear you down. You start to wonder if your prayers mattered, if your obedience meant anything. If you misunderstood God's voice somewhere along the way, you replay past decisions, searching for the mistake that might explain why everything feels paused. What makes this season so difficult is that you are not being asked to fix anything. You are being asked to continue, to keep walking without fresh confirmation, to live faithfully without emotional reinforcement. This is where many people grow tired, not because they stop believing in God, but because believing begins to feel unrewarded. The Bible does not hide from this reality. Many of the people God trusted most walked through long seasons where he said nothing new, no updates, no reassurances, no explanations. And yet, those seasons were not empty. They were formative. God was not absent. He was shaping something deeper than understanding. Silence is not the same as neglect. And a lack of answers does not mean a lack of purpose. Sometimes God grows quiet, not because you are off course, but because he is teaching you how to walk without leaning on constant direction. Faith reaches a different depth when it is no longer carried by feeling but by conviction. If you are in a season where God seems quiet, where prayer feels one-sided, where obedience continues without clarity, stay with this message, because learning how to live faithfully when God says nothing may be one of the most important spiritual lessons you will ever learn. Number 1. Learning to obey without reassurance. There is a particular discomfort that comes when obedience is no longer followed by reassurance. Earlier in your faith, obedience often felt affirmed. You sensed peace quickly. You noticed small confirmations. You felt seen. But in this season, obedience feels strangely quiet. You do what you believe God has asked of you, and nothing responds. No inner warmth, no outward sign. Just the ongoing responsibility to choose rightly, without knowing if it is noticed. This is where obedience begins to change its nature. It stops being fueled by encouragement and starts being sustained by conviction. You obey not because it feels good, but because you know it is right. This shift is subtle but profound. God is not removing reassurance to make obedience harder. He is removing it to make obedience purer. The Bible shows that reassurance is not the foundation of faith. Faith rests on trust in God's character, not on constant feedback. When reassurance disappears, it exposes what obedience was built on. Was it built on relationship or on reward, on trust or on emotional reinforcement? Obeying without reassurance can feel risky. You may worry that you are doing the wrong thing, you misunderstood God, or that you are wasting time. But faith that depends on reassurance will always struggle in silence. God knows this, so he teaches you how to obey without needing to feel certain at every step. This kind of obedience reshapes your inner life. It humbles you. It slows you down. It removes the need to be seen or affirmed. You begin to obey because it aligns with who God is, not because it produces immediate comfort. And though this can feel lonely, it deepens your relationship with him in ways reassurance never could. When obedience continues without reassurance, it becomes an act of trust rather than a response to emotion. You learn to lean on what you know about God, not what you feel from him. And this is where faith becomes resilient. It no longer collapses when silence arrives. It stands quietly, firmly, even when no one applauds it. If you are obeying God without feeling anything in return, do not assume your obedience is unnoticed. Often this is the season when God is teaching you how to walk by faith rather than by feeling. And faith learned this way is not easily shaken. Number 2, staying faithful when nothing changes. One of the hardest aspects of silence is not that God says nothing, but that nothing seems to move. You pray, and circumstances remain the same. You stay faithful, and the situation does not shift. Days pass, then weeks, sometimes longer, and the weight of sameness becomes heavier than disappointment ever was. This is where fatigue sets in. Not the kind that comes from struggle, but the kind that comes from repetition, doing the right thing over and over without seeing progress. Showing up when it feels like it makes no difference. Faithfulness in this season is not dramatic. It is quiet endurance. The Bible speaks often about perseverance, but living it feels different than reading about it. Perseverance without change tests your motivation. You begin to ask why you are still praying the same prayers, making the same choices, holding the same standards. It is tempting to loosen your grip, not because you no longer believe, but because you are tired of waiting. Staying faithful when nothing changes requires a shift in how you define faithfulness. Faithfulness is no longer measured by results. It is measured by presence, by consistency, by your refusal to walk away simply because nothing has improved yet. God often uses unchanging seasons to form steady hearts. When circumstances do not reward you, your faith is forced to mature. You learn how to stay without needing visible progress to justify your commitment. You learn that faithfulness is not a strategy to change God's mind, but a posture that shapes your own. This kind of faithfulness is costly because it offers little immediate satisfaction. There is no momentum to lean on, no evidence to point to, just the quiet decision to remain. Yet this is often where the deepest trust is formed. Trust that does not depend on outcomes but on relationship. If you are in a season where nothing seems to change despite your faithfulness, do not underestimate what is happening beneath the surface. God is teaching you how to stay rooted when growth is not visible, and faith that survives stillness is faith that can endure far more than movement ever could. Number 3, holding your integrity in the silence. Silence has a way of revealing who you really are. When no one is watching closely, when no one is affirming your choices, when obedience no longer brings recognition, integrity is tested at its deepest level. This is the season where your faith is lived in private, not displayed in public. And private faith is always more demanding than visible faith. In the quiet, there is a subtle temptation to loosen your standards. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, but just enough to feel relief. You tell yourself that a small compromise will not matter, that no one will notice, that you deserve a break, and perhaps no one does notice. But integrity is not shaped by what others see. It is shaped by what you choose when there is no immediate consequence. The Bible reminds us that God sees what is hidden, but in silence, that truth can feel distant. When God is not speaking, it can feel as though he is not watching. And that is when integrity becomes a personal decision, rather than a spiritual performance. You remain faithful, not because you feel accountable, but because faithfulness has become part of who you are. Holding integrity in silence means continuing to choose honesty when dishonesty would be easier, choosing purity when compromise would bring comfort, choosing humility when bitterness would feel justified. These choices are rarely celebrated. Often they are invisible, but they shape the soul in profound ways. Silence strips away external motivation and exposes internal alignment. You discover whether your values are rooted in conviction or convenience, and though it can feel lonely to hold your integrity without acknowledgement, this is where faith becomes deeply personal. You are no longer living for approval, divine or human. You are living from trust. God often allows silence to refine integrity, because integrity cannot be borrowed. It cannot be sustained by emotion alone. It must be chosen repeatedly, quietly, and without applause. And when you hold your integrity in this season, you are becoming someone who can be trusted in greater seasons to come. If you are guarding your heart, your actions, and your character, even when no one seems to be watching, do not assume it is wasted. Silence does not mean invisibility. It means formation. God is shaping a faith that stands firm without needing to be seen. Number 4. Living without clarity, but not without direction. One of the most uncomfortable aspects of God's silence is the absence of clarity. You want answers. You want to know what comes next. You want to understand where this path is leading. But instead of a detailed map, you are given just enough light to take the next step, and that can feel deeply unsettling. Living without clarity forces you to confront your need for control. You realize how much peace you once drew from knowing the plan. When clarity disappears, anxiety often follows. You begin to fear making the wrong move, missing God's will, or stepping outside His purpose. The temptation is to stop moving altogether until certainty returns. But the Bible shows that God often guides without explaining. Direction does not always come with detail. Sometimes it comes as a quiet nudge, rather than a clear instruction. You are not told where the road ends, only which way to walk today. And faith learns to function in that limited light. Living this way requires trust that God's guidance is sufficient, even when incomplete. You begin to understand that clarity is not the same as direction. Clarity explains. Direction leads. And God is far more interested in leading you than in satisfying your need to understand everything. This season teaches you to pay attention to small acts of obedience, simple decisions, daily faithfulness. You stop waiting for a dramatic revelation and start honoring the quiet instructions you already know. Love well. Speak truthfully. Remain consistent. These are not unclear, they are just unglamorous. Walking without clarity deepens reliance. You learn to lean on God's presence rather than His explanations. And though this can feel vulnerable, it also creates intimacy. You are not following a plan anymore. You are following Him. If you are living in a season where clarity feels absent, do not assume you are directionless. Often God removes clarity to strengthen trust. He is teaching you how to move forward without needing to see the entire road. And faith that can walk this way is faith that can endure uncertainty without losing its way. Number 5. Guarding your heart from bitterness. Silence has a way of testing not just your faith but your heart. When answers delay and clarity remains absent, bitterness can begin quietly. It rarely announces itself. It slips in through small disappointments, unanswered prayers, and the slow accumulation of unmet expectations. You may not even recognize it at first. You simply feel less tender, less hopeful, more guarded. Bitterness does not usually come from one painful moment. It grows from prolonged waiting without explanation. When God says nothing, the heart begins to fill in the gaps on its own. You start interpreting silence as indifference, delay as disinterest, stillness as distance, and if left unchecked, these interpretations harden into quiet resentment. The Bible warns us to guard our hearts, not because life will always be harsh, but because the heart is shaped by what it holds on to. In silence, your heart becomes vulnerable to narratives that God never spoke. You may begin to assume that your faithfulness has gone unnoticed, that your obedience has been taken for granted, or that God is asking more of you than he should. Guarding your heart in this season means resisting the urge to assign meaning where God has given none. It means choosing humility over interpretation, choosing trust over assumption, choosing patience over judgment. This is not denial, it is discipline. You are disciplining your heart, not to settle into conclusions that will poison your faith. Bitterness is dangerous because it feels justified. You have waited, you have obeyed, you have endured. And yet, bitterness slowly turns your endurance into entitlement. It whispers that you deserve more explanation, more comfort, more clarity. And while God does care about your pain, bitterness distorts how you receive his care. Guarding your heart means staying honest without becoming hard. It means acknowledging disappointment without letting it define you. It means bringing your confusion to God rather than carrying it as silent accusation. You learn to speak your questions without letting them calcify into resentment. If you feel your heart growing tired, cautious, or withdrawn, do not ignore it. Silence is not meant to harden you. It is meant to deepen you. God is far more interested in preserving your heart than in speeding up the process. And when you guard your heart in silence, you protect your ability to love, trust, and remain open even when answers are slow. Number 6. Continuing to do good without emotional reward. There comes a stage in silence when even doing good feels heavy. Not because it is wrong, but because it no longer brings the satisfaction it once did. Serving feels unnoticed. Kindness feels unreciprocated. Obedience feels routine rather than joyful. You still believe in what is right, but the emotional reward has faded. This is one of the most refining moments of faith. Doing good without emotional reward forces you to confront why you do what you do. Earlier in your journey, obedience may have been fueled by passion, gratitude, or a strong sense of closeness to God. In silence, those feelings are often absent. What remains is decision. The Bible encourages believers not to grow weary in doing good, not because weariness will not come, but because it will. Weariness does not mean you are failing. It means you are human. The challenge is not to avoid weariness, but to continue despite it. Continuing to do good without emotional reinforcement reshapes your faith into something stable. You stop relying on motivation and begin relying on commitment. You choose to act in alignment with God's character, even when it does not feel rewarding. This kind of faith is not driven by inspiration. It is sustained by resolve. In silence, good deeds become quieter, less visible, less celebrated. And that can feel discouraging. But it is in this hidden faithfulness that character is formed. You learn to serve without applause, to love without acknowledgement, to give without immediate return. These are not losses, they are investments. God often allows emotional reward to fade so that obedience is no longer transactional. You are no longer doing good to feel close to him. You are doing good because it reflects who he is and who you are becoming. This removes performance from faith and replaces it with integrity. If you find yourself doing what is right without feeling uplifted by it, do not assume something is wrong. This may be the season where your faith is becoming durable. God is teaching you how to remain faithful when feelings fluctuate, and faith that continues without emotional reward is faith that can withstand seasons far more demanding than this one. Number 7. Trusting God's character when his voice is absent. When God says nothing for a long time, faith reaches its most vulnerable point. Not because belief disappears, but because it loses fresh input. There are no new words to lean on, no recent confirmations to replay, no emotional reminders that God is near. And in that space, faith must decide what it is truly built upon. This is where trust shifts from experience to character. You stop trusting God because of what he is currently saying or doing, and you begin trusting him because of who he has already revealed himself to be. This is a quiet but profound transition. Faith is no longer fueled by immediacy. It is sustained by memory, truth, and conviction. The Bible consistently points people back to God's character when circumstances and communication grow quiet. His faithfulness in the past becomes the anchor for uncertainty in the present. You remember who He has been, not because you feel it now, but because it is true regardless of your current experience. Trusting God's character requires restraint. You resist the urge to redefine Him based on silence. You refuse to assume that quiet means absence, or that delay means indifference. You hold on to the truth that God does not change, even when your awareness of Him does. This kind of trust is not emotional. It is deliberate. You choose to believe that God is still good, still present, still intentional, even when there is no evidence to support that belief in the moment. And that choice is costly. It requires humility to admit that you do not understand, and courage to continue trusting anyway. Silence strips faith down to its foundation, without new words to cling to. You are left with the core of what you believe about God. Is He trustworthy? Is He faithful? Is He consistent? These questions are no longer theoretical. They become deeply personal. When you trust God's character in silence, your faith becomes stable rather than reactive. It is no longer dependent on circumstances or communication. It is anchored in truth that does not fluctuate. And this kind of faith endures. It does not panic when God is quiet. It waits with confidence rooted in who God has proven Himself to be. If you are learning to trust God without hearing Him, know that this is not lesser faith. It is deeper faith. You are not being asked to abandon reason or hope. You are being invited to trust God at a level that does not require constant reassurance. And faith that can rest in God's character when His voice is absent is faith that has grown strong. Conclusion: how to live faithfully when God says nothing. There are seasons in life when faith feels quiet, stripped of comfort, and unsupported by clarity. Not because God has stepped away, but because He is asking something deeper of you. Living faithfully when God says nothing is not about enduring silence perfectly. It is about remaining present, honest, and committed when faith no longer feels rewarding. You have seen that silence does not mean stagnation. Obedience without reassurance refines your motives. Faithfulness without visible change strengthens your resolve. Integrity in the dark shapes your character. Direction without clarity deepens your dependence. Guarding your heart preserves your tenderness. Doing good without emotional reward builds endurance. And trusting God's character without hearing His voice anchors your faith to something unshakable. This kind of faith is not dramatic. It does not draw attention. It does not produce quick testimonies. But it is the kind of faith Scripture consistently honors. Quiet, steady, resilient. Faith that remains when there is no applause, no affirmation, and no explanation. If you are in a season where God feels silent, do not assume your faith is weak. Often it is being strengthened in ways that cannot yet be seen. You are learning how to live from conviction rather than emotion, from truth rather than sensation, from trust rather than certainty. Do not rush to escape this season. Do not judge yourself for feeling tired, and do not conclude that God is distant simply because He is quiet. Silence is not the end of God's involvement. It is often the space where the deepest formation takes place. If this message spoke to where you are, take time to reflect on how you are living, not just how you are feeling. Share this with someone who may be struggling to remain faithful in a quiet season. And if you want to continue exploring what it means to grow a faith that endures beyond emotion and circumstance, stay connected. Learning how to live faithfully when God says nothing may be one of the most defining journeys of your faith.